All right, good morning, everyone, and welcome back from your team stand-ups. Today, we're going to be covering Flask, models, and PostgreSQL. So Flask connects to PostgreSQL. We've seen that information before, but today we're going to dive a little bit more into how this process works, more of a review to freshen us up right before we dive into Django. So let's do a little bit of structure here, or what we'll be covering today. So this is our database schema. Starting off, we'll do a review of the database schema. After that, we'll review how to create a Flask server. We'll connect Flask to PostgreSQL using a URI. We learned this on Monday, so we should be able to provide a URI to Flask ourselves. What is a model? We'll go over creating models, what are views, interacting with models through API views, and passing arguments through API views. After that, before, we've seen how to interact with models utilizing .all. Well, as we saw with SQL, there's quite a bit of other things that we can do to grab SQL queries. We don't always have to utilize all. There's such a thing as a where statement. Well, we'll see that coming into effect when we get to filter by. Get will be something that works for IDs. First will return us the first, and then we'll see filter, where filter is utilized for more complex queries than something that can be done by filter by. And then after that, we'll just, to conclude the class, we'll go over what we're missing and why we'll be utilizing Django over the next couple of weeks. At this point, does anyone have any questions over what we'll be covering today?
Are you able to copy and paste like those bullet points into the chat or something? Because I can't find that on the curriculum.
Absolutely, yes.
Thank you.
Go ahead and paste that into our Whiskey channel, and that is correct. That is not in our curriculum just yet, but I will get that up there ASAP. Thank you so much, everyone, for your patience. Okay, everything has been posted. This will also be posted in demos and notes, but there is our breakdown of today's lecture. Any other questions? If there aren't any questions, I'm going to go ahead and move into our step one, which we're going to review our schema and relationships. I'm sure at this point, we're all tired of listening about games. I saw a comment from yesterday's review saying that we are tired of working with the game store, but unfortunately, today's lesson is built around the game store. So in game store, we have these different connections. We have our game, our employee, we have our action figure, and our poster were the first four tables that we started with. After that, we slowly evolved our schema to make sure that we had the correct comments, that we had checks for any sort of regex that we needed to fit in. We ensured that we had the correct constraints necessary to be able to meet the requirements of our database. And we wanted to make sure that we only took in the proper game data. Now, additionally, we created a genre game, which is a connecting table for a many-to-many relationship between genre and game. We also created a gaming engine, which has a many-to-one relationship from games to one specific engine. We have our employee, which has a many-to-one relationship from shifts to employee, meaning one employee can have many shifts, and a social security relationship to our employee, meaning that one employee can only have one social security. So that's our schema drawing overall. If we take a look at our actual schema or my project breakdown here, you can see that I have this backend directory. If I open up that backend directory, I have something like DB and server. And if I take a look within DB, I have all of my CSV data and my store SQL, which we've been working to develop for the last couple of days. This is actually the same store SQL that we worked on yesterday during our review process to ensure that we don't have anything weird or anything new. This is coming straight from yesterday's lecture. All right. Does anyone have any questions regarding our database schema and that quick overview of it? Okay, doesn't look like there are any questions. Let's go ahead and keep pushing forward to our next step. So we just reviewed our schema. Let's go ahead and go over how to create a Flask server all over again. Now, we installed these things globally in our machine, so we should have it available. If you installed it in a Python virtual environment, please activate that virtual environment to be able to run these or import these installments. But let's go ahead and start grabbing, let's start grabbing files. Ooh, switching from JavaScript to SQL to Python has messed a little bit with my import statements. But I'm gonna say that it's from first, and actually in this case I want to, nope, that's correct. From Flask, interesting. Let me go ahead and pip install Flask. It doesn't seem like I have it in my machine. Okay, says my requirements are already satisfied, so there's Flask, and then from Flask course, I'm gonna need course. I am also going to need SQL Alchemy. And I believe that is it for now. Okay, so there I imported my Flask. I have Flask course and my SQL Alchemy. We won't worry about course just yet. And actually we won't need course for this lecture, but maybe we'll go into it if we have enough time. Let's go ahead and take a look at the Flask documentation here so that we can learn a little bit about how Flask works and how we can get this to work. So currently I just opened up Flask, and inside of Flask, I'm seeing this Flask object, which works with it seems like it implements in WSGI. We'll cover this once we go into GUnicorn during our deployment week. But here we have a pretty good example of how to initialize our app. So usually create a class, which is Flask instance in your main module. And we see that we have an init.py file in your package. I do have an init.py file in my package, so great. Then it tells me from Flask, import Flask, and this is how you can initialize your Flask app. So let me go ahead and create my app here. I'm going to say that my app is equal to Flask, and then it just needs a name. I could either give it a string or I could give it the same name that I have above, but in this case, I'm going to name it app. Okay, so my app now works. It's able to, I've created an instance of this class from, if we all remember OOP, this is going to just simply create an instance of the class. But there's a specific functionality that I need to be able to run the server. Does anybody remember how I could run the Flask server?
Are you talking about debugging? Or the debug equal true in main?
Yeah, so there's something like debug equals true and main. Let's go ahead and run this. So if we take a look at the Flask class, it tells me all of the different parameters that it can take in, right? This is things that can be passed into the initializer. And it shows me that it has a couple of default values. The default values being false, none, etc. But I can do something like app.run. And if I take a look at this .run, let's see what it's actually doing. So the method .run, which belongs to the class of Flask, is going to expect, we can give it a host. It's calling self, which is the instance itself, a port, and the debug that we want it to run in. So we could pass in the argument debug, and we could pass in the argument port. I'm going to do both. Mainly for port, because Flask will try to run on port, I believe it's 5,000. And when you try to run it on that port, it ends up causing an issue with some of the Mac OS environments. Since when you try to run it, apparently that port's being utilized by machines to do something else that has to do with security. So we're going to specify a port to make sure that it doesn't cause a conflict. And we're going to make sure that we have debug equals true. So let's do that. I'm going to do app.run. Going to put debug equals true. My default host will be myself. So I don't need to pass it something in there, since we can see that it takes in none. So it looks like I could just pass in port. And for port, I wanted to run, it's expecting an integer. We could see that being provided to us, port integer. So I wanted to run on port 8,000. All right, so let's execute this script here. I'm currently within server. I'm gonna run Python app.py. Okay, so we see that something is running. It's telling me, hey, you need to run this somewhere else. Let's open that up. And we can see a URL not found, which is okay. This is what I expected to see. All right, we get a URL not found because when I go to this URL of 127.0.0.1 at port 8000, there is no function that's returning a response, so it doesn't know what to do. Okay, great. So if I wanted this to return something like hello whiskey at port 8000, what do I need to add between the line 5 and line 7 Go ahead, Jose.
Is it like your index page
Okay,
or like a function for that?
okay, awesome. Yeah, let me go ahead and control C here. So just like in our React router, we had to specify routes, right? And in this case, we need a route that will display at index, which index is the same thing as slash. And just like Jose said, this is going to be a functional base. So we have something here, we're going to call it home. It's not going to take in any arguments. And all it's going to return is hello whiskey. Okay, well, how do I make this into an app route? Let's take a look at the app again, or let's take a look at Flask again. And I'm sure if I scroll down here, the reason why I'm showing this, I know it off the top of my head, but I want to make sure that I can show everyone how to find it within the file itself, so that if you ever need to create this, you can create it on your own. All right, this is taking a considerable amount of more time than I expected. Okay, so there's run. Let me do it this way. There we go. So here we can see that we have our URL for, and it tells me how to apply it. So it tells me that I need to utilize this app.route to be able to apply it. Let me scroll down here. Maybe it tells me how to, it gives me a little bit more of an explanation. Let's see. Static route, static route. There we go. Add a static route. So init. There it is. So it tells me how I could utilize it, but I don't think this is the right one. Send a static file. So generate a URL. So it looks like this is going to be the closest we'll get from the document, from this this script, as far as a comment to how to apply it. But let's take a look at how we can actually apply it within our server. So we made a function, and if I execute this function, it will actually return hello home. But just like we said, we need to build a router that will tell this server to execute this function and return hello whiskey as a response to our browser. So all I'm going to do is I'm going to use the decorator sign, reference my app, and then I'm going to reference route. And there it tells me it expects some things. It expects a rule. So in this case, it's going to be the backward slash. And let's take a look at what route actually means. There we go. So setup method, route, it's callable. There's my decorator. And it gives me a pretty simple example that looks exactly like what I have here, right? We have our app.route. It can take in the route at which it's going to be going to, which in this case, it will be a slash. And it seems like I can specify parameters like methods. which should be set to a list, and I can specify whether that will be a get, post, or delete. So let's go ahead and say methods equals get. Now let's run the server here. Let's refresh this page. And now we can see it saying hello whiskey. Okay, so before we go any further, let's do a quick overview over what we've done so far. We've grabbed Flask from Flask. We made an instance of the class of Flask, which is this is just OOP. Flask is a class. Made that instance and stored it under the variable app. From there, we are accessing a method named route, telling this method that the route it will respond to is the index, and that the only acceptable methods for the route will be a get request. Then we've made a function that will be triggered by this decorator named home that will return the string hello whiskey, as we can see in our browser here. And then finally on line 12, once again, we're grabbing our class instance of app using the run method and passing in two arguments to the run method, or two parameters to the run method. One being debug equals true, and the second being the port 8000, which we can see it running on port 8000 down here. Does anyone have any questions about how to run a Flask server or anything that we've covered so far? Okay, doesn't look like there are any questions. So let's go ahead and start looking at the next portion of our lecture. So we did a quick review over creating a Flask server, but now we want to connect a Flask to Postgres using a URI. We've gone over this before. How can I connect Flask to Postgres utilizing a URI? No takers? Go ahead,
I'll
Edge.
give it a shot. Before when we learned about the actual path to the Postgres database where you have like your at, and then you have the, I think it was localhost, and then you have your password and all that stuff. You have to use that route. That's all the information I've got though. That's my shot in the dark.
Okay, awesome. Yeah, so let's try to access our database through Postgres here. Let's go ahead and do that. So if I run PSQL, I want to make sure that I specify the host, which in this case, it's going to be my local host. I want to specify the port, which in this case, it will be 5432. And I want to specify the user, which it will be Francisco Avila. And finally, I want to specify the database, which is store underscore DB. Okay, and it was able to enter. So we know that this, oh, hello. We know that this command here is pretty similar to what we need up here. Yeah, that's Robert, yeah. All right, so I'll give us a little hand here. We have our app.config, and we want to specify in the config of our app that we have an SQL alchemy. I can spell, I promise. Database URI. So that's going to add an entry into the config dictionary of our app. All right, we know this is a dictionary because of the way we're entering this information. Config is just a dictionary that we're adding an entry to, and it belongs to app. So app has an attribute named config that is a dictionary, And we're simply just adding a new key named SQL Alchemy Database URI. And we're making it equal to the URI that matches this specific SQL command up above. So that when SQL Alchemy connects to our app, it's able to find this URI and utilize it to load our database. All right. So we have this SQL command here. How do I turn this SQL command into a URI address? Go ahead, Jens.
Would you just type out the route, the route to your database? So localhost, HTTP localhost 5432, and then the name of your database. That's just a guess.
Okay, and then slash and the name of my database. Okay, yeah, that's pretty close. So we're getting closer, right? Go ahead, Kara.
Don't you also need a username and password in the front of that as well?
All right, so let's add our username here. Since I don't have a password, I'm not going to add a password. Okay, so there we have Francisco Avila entering localhost at port 5432 for store DB. Okay, there's something else missing. Currently, I have this HTTP, but I'm not running it with HTTP. It's connecting to my machine. What is the parent that I'm trying to enter? Go ahead, Jose.
PostgreSQL.
Nice. So let's go ahead and add PostgreSQL. And I'm utilizing PsychoPG, so I'm going to go ahead and place that in there as well. All right, so PostgreSQL plus PsychoPG will utilize the user, Francisco Avila, to enter localhost at port 5432 at the database store DB. And I'm using that through my SQL Alchemy database. Great. What now? I've added a new key. Oh, sorry. I've added a new key into my config dictionary that falls into my app. But now I need to utilize SQL Alchemy to actually connect to this database through my app. All I'm going to do now is run db is equal to SQL Alchemy and pass in my app. And let's take a look at SQL Alchemy here. So SQL Alchemy integrates with Flask. This handles setting up one or more engines, associating tables and models. Let's see if it gives me a pretty good example. If I come down below, it doesn't seem to give me a good example. Okay, well, there I can see that it takes in self. It seems that it's expecting Flask, or that it's expecting an app, and this should be a Flask instance. Otherwise, it will provide none. And I was hoping that there would be something that specifies that within the Flask instance, there needs to be this SQL Alchemy configuration, but I don't seem to be able to find it. Oh, there you go. So the following keys from app.config are used, and it tells me that it's trying to find the SQL Alchemy database URI to connect into it. There's these other things that are also used here, but we won't go into these because we'll be utilizing Django to take our steps further. So far we have our database SQL Alchemy database URI. We can copy this, come over to our app, and make sure that the spelling is correct. I'm just gonna paste it. Nothing seemed to change. All the spelling is correct. Okay, so quick review again. I have an instance of Flask named app under the variable app. I have a config dictionary under the variable app, which is an instance of Flask. So config is just an attribute of the class Flask. For that config file, or that config dictionary, I'm entering a new key named SQL Alchemy Database URI with the value PostgreSQL plus PsychoPG. I will utilize the user Francisco Avila to enter at localhost on port 5432 with the database store DB. From there, I'll utilize SQL Alchemy, pass in the Flask instance. SQL Alchemy, once it's initialized, it's going to take in the app and it's going to say, all right, well, inside of this app, in the config, there should be a SQL Alchemy database URI. Once it finds that, it's going to utilize this PsychoPG and SQL to actually enter the database and allow us to run commands against the database. At this point, does anyone have any questions over what we did for connecting SQL to SQL to Flask? I mean, PostgreSQL to Flask. I apologize. Will, I see you have a question. Go ahead.
Yes, I noticed that at the, line 5, you put the string app, and like on the lesson from like week 2 or 3, there's like a dunder name instead. Like, does that make a difference?
Yeah, definitely. If I were to utilize a dunder name, it would just look at the name of the file and pass that into this as an argument. So it would still end up being named app. It's not necessarily a difference. It would get interpreted into a string. Does that answer your question, Will?
Gotcha. Thanks.
Of course. Edge?
You put the plus PsychoPG. Don't know if we covered or if I just don't remember. Can you speak a little bit about what PsychoPG is and why we're using that?
Yeah, definitely. So PsychoPG is a Python, I don't want to call it a library. So it's utilized to be able to speak between Python and Django. Utilized to speak between Python and PostgreSQL. It's essentially going to run our Python code, and it's going to allow our Python code to be interpreted into SQL queries. It works kind of like as an interpreter. That's the way I think about it. It works as a terp, right? I write Python code, and when it goes to SQL, it turns my Python code into SQL queries. And then when SQL returns a query set or it returns a return value, well, PsychoPG just tells Python, hey, here's this query set, which is the same thing as the return value from SQL, but in a way that I can work with it through Python. Does that answer your question, Edge?
Yes, it does. Thank you.
I can actually add to that, Francisco.
Yeah, go ahead, DJ.
When we don't specify PsychoPG, it looks for PsychoPG2 by default, which is the old package. If you see that fun fact there note on Francisco's webpage, there's no PsychoPG3. PsychoPG without a number is now PsychoPG3. That's the newest copy. And by default, you should be using that instead of the older library.
Awesome. Thank you, DJ. Go ahead, Jens.
This was tacking on to what Will was asking earlier about the dundernet on line 5. That app where you say app as a string, that must match the file name, right? Is that where that's coming from? So if you named this app.py, if that was for whatever reason, like server.py, then that would have to match the file name.
No, yeah, so this does not have to match the file name, nor does it have to match the variable name. I can still run it this way, and it will execute just fine. The only thing that changes is the serving Flask app server. So this is the name that I am passing this app, and that's what I am naming it. Typically, you want to name the variable the same as the name of the server. Does that answer your question?
Yes, you're defining it right then and there what it's being called, right?
Exactly.
Right
yes.
Okay.
All right. Awesome. So we just saw it run. We know that this works correctly. If I wanted to make sure that this database URI worked well, what other tool could I use in my command line to try to enter storedb here through the terminal and ensure that that URI is working correctly? How else do we enter PostgreSQL? Or how do I do that through the command line?
You could enter PSQL to get
Yeah.
into the shell.
Awesome. Yeah, I could use pSQL, pass in the URI, and if it works correctly, it should be able to connect me. Oh, I apologize. I put the psycho-PG in there. Let me go ahead and remove that part. Okay. So now we can see that by removing the psycho-PG, because this is just straight trying to access SQL, we don't need psycho-PG. We only need it up here because we're trying to do it through Python. So you can see that it's PSQL Postgres, and it was able to utilize the user, the correct local host, and the correct port, and it entered the correct database into StoreDB. All right. Does anyone else have any other questions? Okay, great. If there are no questions, let's go ahead and move on to our next portion, which is what is a model? So when I think of a model is essentially a class representation of one of our database tables. I'm sure we've all seen that Spider-Man meme where there's like two Spider-Mans pointing at each other, right? And it's supposed to be like the multiverse thing, and then or sometimes there's a bunch of Spider-Mans and they're all pointing at each other. I think of one of those Spider-Mans being a SQL table or create table query, and then the other one being the class being instantiated, right? They're essentially a mirror of one another, and that's what you want the outcome to be, for them to be a mirror of one to the other. So let's go over that dynamic here. I'm going to go into DB, grab our store SQL, close our app because we won't need it for a while. And I'm going to go ahead and bring up this models.py here. All right. So now we have these models.py. It's working pretty well. And we have our SQL as well. Let me go ahead and bring up our app. How can I do this without creating a circular import? All right, we'll do this on this file first, and then afterwards we'll try to import them without creating a circular import, but worst scenario, we may have to copy and paste them back into our original file. So let's go over creating these tables as actual models. So currently right now we have some SQL queries on the left-hand side, and I want to create some models on the right-hand side. So let's start creating some tables by creating some classes. So I'm going to create a class named genre. It is not going to take anything into the class as an initializer for now. And instead, I'm going to go ahead and start defining the two different things that we have here. So we have our genre ID. You know what? This isn't going to work. I apologize, everyone. Let me go ahead and open up this app.py so that we have it available for us. And then we'll just do everything in there. Okay. All right, so again, we're gonna have our class named genre. Within genre, we're gonna grab from db.model. And that's how this class knows, or this Flask server is gonna know that this is in reference to an actual database model. And a model is the same thing as a table. So in this case, our table would be genre. That's why we're naming it the same thing. We know we have the field of genre ID, which should be an integer. or sorry, DB dot integer. And then we have a genre name, which should be DB dot string. All right. Does anyone have any questions about how this create table genre turns into this genre class? Let's go ahead and clean this up a little bit. We want this to be db.column. It's going to be an integer, but we also wanted to say primary key is equal to true. Oh, sorry, Natalie, I'll answer your question here shortly. db.column. And we wanted to have a database string. There's some sort of syntax error going on here. There you go. All right, perfect. Go ahead, Natalie.
Just to confirm, do the like genre ID in your model and and genre name, those have to match the column names from your table?
Yes, so the same exact table name that I'm utilizing, or the same field name that I'm utilizing on my model, should be the same exact field name that I'm utilizing on my table.
Okay, cool. Thank you.
Go ahead, Brett.
Just real quick, it's integer on line 14. Yeah.
Thanks. Good catch. All right. Yams.
Just checking with Natalie. Is this well, chicken and the egg kind of situation? Which one has had to match which first? Was it that our model here in app.py had to match the names, like line 14 in app.py had to match line 4, or line 4 had to match line 14?
Yeah, so line 14 of the genre class.
I was like,
Yes.
I haven't seen it.
Yeah, that needs to match the genre ID on line 4.
Okay. Okay, thanks.
Of course. All right, let's go ahead and run this to make sure this is working correctly so far. Okay, so it looks like everything's working great. It was able to connect without raising an error, so my genre was able to connect correctly. But notice that we're not passing in a set amount of string. We could, right? We only want a set amount of string, which is 20. We have our primary key up there, but it doesn't specify that this is a serial primary key. Let's see what else we can do. Let's go into our gaming engine. Can somebody walk me through creating this gaming engine class?
So wouldn't you just take the engine underscore ID or db.model, I'm sorry.
All right.
And then engine underscore ID is equal to db.column. And because it's a primary key, you would want to put the primary key equals true. I don't, since it's serial, I don't know if there's something extra. Like, I don't know if we would do db.serial. I don't know how you would do that.
Got it. Yeah, we would actually specify that it's still just an integer. Because
Oh,
it gets interpreted as an integer. Awesome.
okay.
What would be the next?
Engine underscore name. and db dot column, and then db dot string, and it looks like you did 20 characters. I'm not sure if we would put the constraints on there. I'm not sure about that.
Yeah, we wouldn't put the constraints just yet. We're essentially doing it as if this was stage 2, right? We drew the database schema. We're at stage 2. We're not adding any constraints yet. We're just building our very
Okay.
basic tables. Okay, so
Okay.
that worked as well. Awesome. Thank you so much, Nika. All right. Can someone other than Nika walk me through creating the game table? Go ahead, Kara.
So it would be its own class for game. And it would be db.model as well, right?
Right.
And you would start with game underscore ID equals db.column db integer primary key equals true. Then engine ID equals column db.integer and game title would be column db.column and then db string. And then do we always have to match the character count?
We don't always have to. We could change it to something different. But for now we're gonna keep it the same. We'll see later on how we could change it, but for now let's keep it the same. So we'll go with 255, what we had before.
Okay. Then quantity and price would also be db integers.
Would price be an integer?
Actually, no, you're right. That would, is there decimal? Is that an option or is it float?
Let's check it out. Let's see. Yeah, looks like we do have a dot decimal. Okay. Exact numerical position, which is P, so decimal 52. It's a number with 3 digits before the decimal and 2. Okay, so it looks like it is a thing. So we have our decimal. And then how many integers and how many places before?
So that would be a 5-2.
All right. And again, we're ignoring our constraints for now, so we have that going pretty well. Let's try to run the server. Okay, so it looks like db.decimal is throwing an error. See if I can do something like this. SQL alchemy type has no decimal. Let's see. It is all caps. All right, awesome. So now we got our game ID, engine ID, game title, quantity, and price. Thank you so much, Kara. Moving on into genre game. Can someone other than Kara and the people who have walked me through the previous classes, walk me through genre game, please? Audience?
Let's see, so since it has to match ID equals DB column, and then this is DB integer being passed, and primary key equals true. And then next we have game ID, game underscore ID equals DB column, and then just pass DB integer. And then genre ID and genre underscore ID equals the exact same as game ID, DB column, and then pass DB integer. And then I don't know if you need to do anything for the phone keys.
Yeah, we're not gonna do anything for them on the Flash server side. We're gonna miss the constraints for this lecture. All right, moving into action figures. How can I do action figures?
I'll try.
Let's hear it.
So create the class action figure and then db.model. And then ID equals db.column, db.integer, and primary key equals true. And then action figure title, that's going to be db.string, 255 in parentheses. And yeah, I think that's it for that one.
Okay.
And then quantity, db.column, in parentheses, db.integer. And I think that's it for that one as well.
Nice.
Then price equals db.column and db.decimal, and within the parentheses 52. And that's it.
Awesome. Thank you, Eric. That was great. Let's make sure both genre and our title and our action figure is working well. Looks like everything's working great there. It's going into poster. Who would like to take over poster?
Sure, I'll give it a stab.
Yeah.
Yeah, so you have class poster. The first one is going to be ID equals db.column, db.types dot, oh, sorry, it's an integer. So just db.integer. Comma, primary key equals true. And then you're gonna go into poster title is db.column, and then db dot string. All right, your next one is quantity, and that's going to be db.integer, db.column, yeah, db.integer. And then the last one is going to be price, db.column, db.types dot decimal, and for mine I have 4, you have 4 2 as well. So 4, 2.
Yeah.
And that should do it.
Okay, awesome. Thanks so much, David. All right, it is officially 9:52. Let's go ahead and take an 8-minute break. Let's come back at 10 o'clock to continue on with our lecture. While we're on our break, I'm going to finish typing out the rest of these models to avoid the repetitiveness for the class. So I'll see everyone back here at 10 o'clock. Thank you so much, everyone. All right, welcome back, everyone. So we have just completed creating each individual class or each individual model for each table. And each model is just representing one table. They're exact representations of each other. Currently, we don't have any constraints or foreign keys being applied, but they're there. They're existing, and we're accepting the correct data. Everything within SQL is being tracked because we ran the SQL file. But as far as SQL Alchemy knows, or as far as our models know, it doesn't have any constraints to be applied yet, other than the length of string or the decimal reinforcement that we've passed here. There is a minor change that we've also made here. We have our models all in a separate file named models.py. We still grab the instance of SQL Alchemy, but SQL Alchemy doesn't become initialized until we import it into our app and run this init app, where we pass in the app, which is the Flask instance of server, into the app. So that's how we get it into two separate files and are able to import all of our different classes to be able to work with. So now we could go ahead and start grabbing all of our classes from this app and actually use them within our routes. Okay, great. Before moving into the next portion of our lecture, does anyone have any questions regarding how we created all of these models from tables? All right, it doesn't seem like there are any questions. So let's go ahead and move into the next portion of our lecture. So now we just went over what is a model. We covered creating models, and we know what views are. But views are essentially just, how do I grab things from a view, right? I want to make sure that I can grab all the information pertaining to an argument for a view. We've gone over a little bit of the API naming conventions, and we know that if we want to make a route for an API that grabs all games, we wouldn't want to grab it by the name of game. So let's go ahead and build an API route that will return all of the different genres. How could we do that? Let's go over this part first. Oh, I see a hand up. Go ahead, Jens.
I guess we could probably make another decorator route.
Okay, so we have at app.route.
And then maybe we'd use the name of the table that we wanted to grab.
All right, so let's grab genres, pluralized. Okay.
And then a get method for this.
All right, we would only want get to be able to reach this API endpoint. So let's go ahead and say get and be all genres.
And then what would we return? We would return some sort of response here.
Yeah, so now we would want to return all of the genres, right? And we covered this a little bit during our SQL, or sorry, our full stack week, but I don't expect everyone to remember it. So let's go ahead and grab a couple of more things, and then we'll work through creating our response. So one, let's go ahead and return all games for now. I'll run this server here. On this right-hand window, I'm going to bring up Thunder Client. I know I should be pinging 8000 API v1, and instead of instructors, I want genres. All right, so there I can see that I get all games. That's my response. Everything seems to be working well. My API request was accepted, processed, and returned a 200 status response. Well, now, how do I actually make it grab all of my genre models? Well, let's go ahead and import genre, which is just a class we have imported now. And let's say all games or genres is equal to genre dot query dot all. And let's print out genres so that we can see it in our server. We run the server. This print statement isn't being triggered, and that's because this function hasn't been triggered yet. In order to trigger my function, I need to send the request. Now, when I send the request to all games, all genres gets queried, and I get a return. Well, notice that I get this query response that has all of my individual genres. Well, I'm actually genuinely curious, so I'm going to try this out. I'm going to see if my representation method works here. I'm assuming that it would. So I'm going to go ahead and send this request. Okay, so it works. There you go. I'm able to, rather than seeing the individual query sets, I can use the representation method to actually see each individual class instance of genre. But it's a class. They're class instances. I have a list of class instances. I can't return this just yet, right? I need to turn it into something that's JSON, that's JSON readable. Well, let's break this command down. What I'm running here is select all from genre. That's all that's happening in line 21. And that value is being stored in genres. Just that instead of getting the SQL table, I'm getting a set of query sets. And that's happening through psychopg. Psychopg grabs that table return and turns it into a list of objects that I can then work with to turn into a JSONifiable response. So let's turn it into a JSON response. So let's say JSON genres. And let's just do, I want to do x dot ID, or sorry, genre. Let's do genre ID for x dot genre ID. And let's also do genre name for x dot genre name for x in genres. And now let's actually print JSON genres here. Gonna run my server runs well. Well, when I send this request, now I have a list of dictionaries, each one of them holding an appropriate genre and name for each individual one. Does anyone have any questions over how we ran this query and turned it into a list of dictionaries? All right, doesn't seem like anyone has any questions. So finally, all I'm going to do is say to return my response, which in this case, it will be JSONify JSON genres. Now, when I send my request, I get a nice response on the right-hand side with each individual genre ID and genre name. And I just made an API endpoint that I can ping to receive all of my genres within my SQL database. Will?
Yeah, so on line 22, what was that basically like destructuring?
On line 22, is this base? No, so in line 22, rather than destructuring, what I'm actually doing is, I'm just gonna go ahead and comment this out. I'm saying that for X in genres, and let me go ahead and make another here. And then let's say JSON genres is equal to an empty list. So for X in genres, I want to, let's see here. Genre dict be equal to a dictionary where genre ID, just grab this here. And then JSON genres dot append genre dict.
Oh, okay, gotcha.
Yeah, I'm not actually doing destructuring. I'm manually changing it into a dictionary and then turning it all into a separate list.
Okay, gotcha.
Of course. Go ahead, David.
Yeah, could you just scroll up to the top of app.py?
Of course.
I Okay, I see. I didn't import genre. Thank you.
Of course. All right, and I'm seeing a question from Edge on the chat. It says, I'm referencing my code from when we did this with Flask on the student DB a couple of weeks ago, and I definitely don't have PsychoPG in the project, yet all the query and stuff work the same. Could you remove the PsychoPG from the app.config just to demonstrate the difference? Yeah, so this is going to be a machine dependency. Some people were able to do it, and some people were not. So you don't 100% have to explicit. You can leave it up to your machine or your specific environment to do it. And I'm sure there's something that we can do to make it happen by default. But to avoid that problem altogether, by putting plus PsychoPG, we're ensuring that this works. So let me go ahead and remove it. And let's see if mine is still able. Yeah, see, so if I remove it, this current machine that I'm working on, so I have one other machine that I use. The other machine works perfectly fine without adding plus PostgreSQL into my URI. But the moment that I try to do it in this current machine that I'm utilizing now, I have to.
1 second, before you reload that, Francisco, see how it says no module name PsychoPG2? That's the default that it was looking for. If it gives you that error, that's when you have to specify it. That's what I got from that. So sorry to add to that.
No, no problem. So now I have to add that plus PsychoPG in order for it to be able to work correctly and load my data. Does that answer your question, Edge?
Yeah, I think it does.
Awesome. I see someone else typing on the chat, so I'm going to wait a little bit. Okay, well, we have to import each class model we defined in our models, or can we import the whole file? That's a great question. And I believe you can do something like from models import star. And then you would have to do something like models.genre. Maybe. Oh, well, this seems to be working. Let me see. Yeah, so you could do something like from models import star, which stands for all, and it could just import everything. That's all the variables and all of the different classes that are in there. You typically don't want to utilize the star method just because you don't know everything that's inside of a file. In this case, we do, so it's safe to use it, but it's definitely not something that you want to use commonly. Does that answer your question, Natalie? I'm going to take that as a yes. All right, moving forward. The next thing that we're going to be covering now will be how to grab one specific game. Well, we could grab the first, and let me go ahead and demonstrate what that does here quickly. Let's go ahead and print genre.query.first. I'm gonna trigger this and we're gonna see it being printed into the console. Well, when I run the first, or the first one gets triggered, the only response that I get is action. So I'm still being able to query. And what this query means is essentially just saying, select all from genre, limit 1. All right, so that returns the first. Okay, let's see what other queries we have here. We have all, we have first, and we have get. Well, this get's going to get us into some arguments. So let's do that next. Let's go into passing arguments through API views. So we're going to make a completely separate view that will return one individual genre. And we're going to give our users the ability to look up that genre, kind of like the Rick and Morty API or like the Pokey API, where people are able to pass in an ID or they're able to pass in a name to be able to grab one specific person. So let's go ahead and do one where we grab it by ID. All right, so let's go ahead and do at app.route. We're going to go ahead and create API v1, and I forgot my initial slash genres /ID. And again, the methods that will be allowed will be get. So now I have this ID here in like arrow brackets, right? I've been inside of arrow brackets. What exactly does that mean, or what capabilities does that give me? Well, when I move into my function, of get genre by ID, I can now tell it that it is expecting a parameter named ID. And for now, let's just return the ID that's getting passed into it. We're going to go ahead and run our Flash server. And let's see what happens when I put 1 at the end of this URL. Well, when I put 1 at the end of the URL, I get back 1. If I put 35 and I send that request, I receive 35 as a response. So if that's what I'm passing into URL, this is my URL path, and that's the parameter, and this is my return. Can somebody break this down for me? Can someone tell me what's happening here?
Is it that you're taking whatever you got when you broke down the JSON to / genres, or whatever you put in the list that you have, and you're just pulling it out by the ID?
So that's what I'm going to end up creating. But I want to make sure that everyone understands this. Oh, go ahead, Jens.
I was gonna say this looks very much like params when we did React. Is that?
Yeah. Awesome. So this arrow brackets specify that this will be a parameter within the URL. It is expecting an argument within the URL. That argument will be a parameter for this function. So I have to expect ID to happen within the function. If I name this something else like int and I send the request, I'm going to get an error because my URL doesn't match the parameter that my function is expecting. And same thing vice versa. If I name this ID and I name this something and I return something, well, when I run this, it tells me that there's an error because it doesn't know what to do with ID. The parameter that my function is expecting must match the parameter that my URL is expecting. Go ahead, Nika.
Okay, so if I'm understanding correctly, you're like basically doing what you did when we did create browser router with like having the backslash colon and then whatever it was that you wanted to put in there so that you could dynamically utilize it.
Yeah, exactly. That's exactly what we're doing, right? Just like in in browser router, where we had to grab something through use params, but we needed a variable name and specified it within the URL. I'm doing the same thing within Flask. Okay, great. So now let's actually grab this query by one individual. So let's say genre is equal to genre.query.get ID. And actually what this expects, I think it expects an argument. Let me go ahead and check my README here. It looks like it just looks at one thing. Let's see if I can open this up. Dot get. Okay, so it looks into the query, which would be the genre, and it will get 5,10. Okay, awesome. So this should work. Let's go ahead and print our genre now. Gonna go ahead and run my server, ping my API. And it looks like this is returning none. And that's because I'm passing in 35. I don't have any ID for 35. Let's do 3 here. Send our request. Well, if I pass in 3, I get the response of RPG3. So this is saying select all from genre where ID or genre ID equals ID or 3. All right, so that's what's happening. Let me go ahead and open up a separate SQL server here so that we can see it. And let's run that exact query. And we can see that the query that gets returned is RPG. Okay, great. So now we need to turn it into something that's JSON. So let's go ahead and do JSON genre. And let's make that equal to a dictionary where genre ID has the value of genre.genre ID. And genre, I believe it's genre name. It is, yes. So genre name has the same thing as genre underscore name. This is an instance of a class that we're currently working with. That's why I'm able to access its attributes through dot notation, and I'm turning it into a dictionary. Finally, all I want to do is return a JSONified response where of JSON genre. And now when I send my request, oh, looks like my app stopped working, so the connection was refused. And now when I send my request, I get a nice representation of a dictionary, or in this case, a JSON object, where genre ID is a key, the value is 3, genre name is a key, and the value is RPG. Does anyone have any questions regarding passing in arguments or the .get query function of our selectors here down below? I want everyone to know this is just for demonstrational purposes. This is not something that we expect everyone to remember. This is a kind of like a preamble to what we're about to go into Django, we'll spend almost days going each individual topic that I just covered so far. So don't think that we expect everyone to memorize this right away.
I have a question.
Go ahead, Natalie.
Sorry, hold on one second. It's kind of
course.
weird. I have it on my speaker. Okay. So the dot get, is that using like the where keyword?
So the dot get specifically references to the IDs. So it's not only accessing the where keyword, it's also accessing where ID equals. All of that dips inside of the dot get function. All right. It doesn't seem like there are any other questions. So let's go ahead and grab something that doesn't belong to genre. Let's grab something that belongs to games. Or actually, let's see, something more interesting here. What do we have? We have employees. Let's start messing around with some employees. We're going to go ahead and build a route that will grab all of our employees, and we're going to filter employees by name. So let me go ahead and take a look at my CSV data just to make sure that I have some good data for the employees. And let's just try to find any employee that has an M inside of it. That should be feasible. All right, so if I were to write a SQL query for that, that SQL query would be somewhere around select all from employee, where employee name is like M. And when that return value comes back, I can see that I have Jane Smith, Mark Johnson, Emily Davis, Michael Lee, etc. We can see that that query worked just fine. Well, now, how do I write that query into our Flask server? Let's go into creating this route. Again, I'm going to follow the standard conventions, API, version 1, employees, nouns, and pluralized nouns is what should be inside of my API naming convention. And now what I want is name to filter by. I'm going to pass in my methods. And my methods that I will accept will be get. Okay. Now I'm going to make my route. So get employee by partial name. Pass in the name parameter, because that's what we expect. And now I'm going to write my query. So let's say employee. Oh, I wrote this with a lowercase. So now we have employee should be equal to employee dot query dot filter. And this is where it gets a little weird, right? So we're going to utilize the filter, not filter by. And filter is specific so that we can run different types of queries. So here we can see an example. Model, field, and like. Okay. So in this case, the model that I'm trying to access is employee. The field that I want to go ahead and grab by would be employee name. And I'm going to try to run the I like argument. I'm not sure if that will work, but we will see. And then I can pass in an actual argument, which what we saw before was the ampersand m ampersand. And from there, we can go ahead and print employees and return employees as our response, just for string for now. I'm gonna go ahead and run my server, make sure it's working well. Okay, my server didn't throw an error, so that's good. I'm gonna run it for employees. Oh, and I did this totally wrong. Let me go ahead and do an F string here. All right. There you go. So now I'm actually utilizing that parameter of name. So API v1 employees pass in M as a parameter. And let's see what it does. Okay, so employees worked. It seems to have returned a total of 4 entries. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 entries. If I take a look at SQL and I run a count, we can see that it is supposed to return 5 different outcomes, right? So we know that it's supposed to return 5. I got 5 out here in my terminal, but now I need to turn them into something that's JSON readable. Well, just like before, I'm going to go ahead and say JSON employees. I'm going to open up a dictionary. Sorry, I'm going to do some list comprehension first. Then I'm going to open up a dictionary. For that dictionary, I know that I'm going to need ID, which should be XID. I'm going to need employee name, which should be X employee name. Position. And salary. And now I can return my response of JSONify JSON employees. I'm going to go ahead and run my app. My app works. Send my request. And there I get all of my employees. That should come back the same as my query. Let me go ahead and open up my query here. So we see that we have 2 for Jane Smith. 2, Jane Smith. We have Mark Johnson, Emily Davis, Michael Lee, and Sarah Miller. All right. Does anyone have any questions regarding how we can grab employees by partial name, how we're actually filtering utilizing the ILike function, and how we turned that query set into a JSON readable or something that's JSONifiable and return that as a response? Go ahead, Jens.
So there we used the ILike because was it the ILike that was not case sensitive?
That's
Or-
correct.
Okay.
All right. Gone over quite a bit of things here. Let's go ahead and use the filter by function. And what's the difference between filter by and the filter function? Well, like I said, the filter function is something for more complicated arguments, right? But the filter by, we can just give that a specific argument and it will be able to run the clause. So for example, in app.py, let's say we want to grab employees by salary. And at this point, we all kind of know how to do this. I want to grab all employees that have a greater salary than than a $40,000 annual salary. Can somebody guide me through writing that SQL query?
I suppose I could try if nobody else wants to.
Yeah, let's hear it, Nika.
So we would do select star from employee where salary is greater than 40,000. Semicolon.
Great. So there you go. We have all of our employees with a greater salary than 40,000. So now we're going to go ahead and turn that into a function or an actual API view. So let's come down here. We're going to go ahead and make our view now. So now, how do I start this view? I need a route. So here we go. We need a route. We need a function. We need to accept a parameter. Query the DB. Return a JSON-ified response. All right, so who can walk me through building the route? All right, at this point, I'm going to go ahead and start calling on people. Go ahead, George. Give it a shot.
Not feeling too confident about this.
Want to take a look at a previous example?
Yeah. I guess we could start off with employees.
Okay, so how do I actually write it? What would be the syntax?
Is it employees equals?
Okay, I see a hand up. Go ahead, Saul.
You want to start off by declaring your app.route. Is that correct? And then it's going to be, was it API/v/employee, and then in our brackets, we could do salary.
Okay, let's actually do salaries here. And the reason why I would like us to switch what we're pluralizing here as our noun is because if we have employees and salaries, these two app routes could clash. Let me go ahead and show that real quick. All right, so now let's go ahead and say that we want something higher than 40,000. If I go ahead and send that through. Oh, that's gonna be because it stopped running. Okay, so we see that we get an empty list, but we didn't get salaries. We're getting an empty list because when I ran this query, it grabbed none. Well, sorry, when I ran this query, it grabbed none. So that's the reason why we're going to switch this up to salaries. And now we run that URL. We can see everything's still coming back as an empty list. But if I run salaries, API / v1 / salaries. Oh, there you go. What's going on here? Do I have a misspelling? So that returned well, but if I add 4,000 into it. Okay, there must have been a spelling error that I might have made. So now we can get our 40,000 showing up. So
You got the get method.
all right, let's have that get method. Awesome. Thank you, Stephen. So methods is equal to get. All right. So now let's go ahead and run this query part, right? How do I make this query that will select all from employees where the salary is greater than 40,000? So let's first start just employees and querying. How do I do that?
Would it be employees equals employee.query.all?
That's right. Employees equals employee.query.all. Great. So that will grab me a list of queries, but now we're going to go into the filter by function. So the filter by function takes in a field that I would want to run against a condition. So currently my condition in my example says equals to the argument. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to make it greater than or less than. And I'm actually going to print the type of salary so that we can see what happens when I send this request. It gets interpreted as a string. So I need to make sure that I cast it into an integer down here. So let's go ahead and run into the filter by function. The field that I want to filter by will be salary. And what I'm going to ask is that salary is greater than salary. And hopefully that doesn't run into a weird statement there. There's our employees. We're going to grab .all. Let's see if this sends us a weird query. Okay, so it seems it takes one position argument, but two were given. Interesting. Field equals argument. Yeah. So I may be misinterpreting this filter by function. Let's go ahead and run filter by salary being equal to salary. Let me see what this does. Well, when I send this request, I still get a problem. Let's see what my problem is. So programming error, operator does not exist, numeric. Okay, so let's turn that into an integer. Yes, I still get salaries. Now I only get one employee because I wanted it to filter by. Well, I'm wondering if it will do greater than. If I run it this way. Not supported between instance. I should have named this a different field. Let's see, salary input. And salary is not defined. Models. All right. We're currently going ahead and we're querying this database, but it doesn't seem to be returning the correct output. So there might be an issue with how we're actually running this. Let me go ahead and do a little bit of research regarding filter by. Uh, It looks like the more commonly used is filter rather than filter by. Let me go ahead and take a look at this error again. That might help me a bit. Takes one positional argument. But two were given. Looks like I may have to only use do equals and supported. Let's see, I got something on the chat here. In SQL, you need to compare values. You should use the filter method instead of the filter by when dealing with comparison operators. I figured. All right. So that doesn't seem, then why would that work? Yeah, I'm gonna have to do some diagnosing and figure out what is going on here. But if we run this back into a filter and do our salary, we can check if our salary is greater. And let me make sure that that is correct. Oh, we have to specify the employee. That the employee salary is greater than salary. Now, when I run this, I get my total number of queries. All right, so now we have our queries for all of our employees that make more than 40,000. So looking at what's next, I've been able to query the DB, but now I have to return a JSONified response. How do I do that? What's next on this function? Go ahead, Brian.
Can you run the employees.json method to convert it?
Let's try it out.
And then return, but you probably should set that equal to like a new variable like employees JSON or something, and then return that.
Okay, let's print it out just to make sure that it works. Let's see what that does. Okay, well, it tells me that it's a list object, and a list object doesn't have something JSON available. So let's try to do something like this. We're gonna ping it. No, it still tells me that it can't do it because it's not JSONifiable. Let's try to use JSON another way. Let's see what happens if I do JSON and then employees. Module object is not callable. Okay. One last try. Let's see what we got here. All right, so it doesn't seem like the JSON will be able to help us here. I don't think even if I load JSON.load, let's see that. Okay, so that didn't work because of the read attribute. So let's try loads instead. That also didn't work. All right, so JSON itself isn't going to be able to just turn this employees because their query sets into something that's JSON readable. So what else can we do? Go ahead, Brian.
If you want, you could create like a little serializer for the employee object that just takes each field and then populates it into like a dictionary object.
Yeah, definitely. We could create serializers. That's going to be something that we're going to be going into during the Django module. So I'm going to go ahead and for now, I'm going to repeat somewhat the same process that I have up here. All right, so I have this JSON employees. It's going to be able to iterate through all the employees and return them. And then finally, I could just return JSONify JSON employees. Great. Now when I ping me, I can see that I have the same exact output where all the employees make more than 40,000. Awesome. All right. Awesome. So now we've completed our Flask server. We did a little bit of exercise over the different things that we can do with this Flask server. Let me go ahead and pull up the models here to the side one more time. We can see how we can run a server, create some models that will interact with our database, connect our server to our database itself, utilizing a database URI, and then afterwards query the database to grab information and run actual requests to get methods, passing arguments, passing string and integer arguments, the different types of queries that are available for us. But we're still missing quite a bit. In this last example, Brian brought up something that we are missing. We're missing serializers, right? I don't want to have to write this over and over again. So there's got to be a better tool for me to just be able to serialize employees in a specific way. Now you could think of that would be something like a function, and maybe I could utilize a helper function to do this. Sure, but the right term would be to utilize a serializer. And we'll be learning about those in Django. What else are we missing within our models and our views? Can anyone think of anything? Go ahead, Jens.
I forgot if this was addressed earlier, but the constraints, are those following right now because they're written in our table, in our schema? Then we don't have to worry about that, or?
Yeah, that's a great question. So just like Jens mentioned, currently all of our constraints and everything happening is happening from our data table, right? From what we created utilizing SQL. But none of those constraints are being reflected within Python. So our server might try to make insertions and run into a conflict because our database won't allow for those insertions. So we need to make sure that our server is tracking on these constraints as well. We're not specifying unique values where there is unique values. We're not specifying anything that could be null or shouldn't be null. Nor are we specifying what else. What other important thing did we learn about before yesterday that should be implemented here? Go ahead, Tom.
We're not defining any relationships in our models, so there's no way to like track what is like there's no way to track that maybe like the social security employee ID field is related to an employee instance from our models.
Yeah, there you go. So there's that problem as well, right? We don't have anything to be able to track associations or relationships. Now we could run a Python script that runs a comparison as it iterates through both query sets, right? And it only grabs the ones that match the ID, but there's got to be a simpler way of doing it. Well, those relationships are called foreign key relationships, which we'll be covering during Django as well. And same things as far as our constraints. All of the constraints that we've created, all the regexes that we created within SQL, we need to make sure that our Python server is also doing those things and has that functionality. There's some things that we can do in Python better than we can do in SQL. So it's important that we utilize Python to its best ability. Constraints will now be called validators. So let me go ahead and pull up our README for today. So constraints will be referenced to in the next lecture or in the next lectures as validators. Tables will be referenced to as models. And relationships will still be referenced to as relationships, but we will have foreign key. Let me do many to one. Will be a foreign key relationship. We will have a 1 to 1, which will be a 1 to 1 relationship. And then we have a many to many, which will actually be a many to many relationship. So we'll be interpreting all of these things over the next week, messing around with models. We've also talked about serializers, utilized to interpret query sets into JSON data. And we've also seen that there's a couple of other things that Flask has that it's just not offering to its best ability. Sure, we're able to pass a parameter of ID, but there's nothing reinforcing that this ID will actually be an integer. So we need URL parameter reinforcement. As we dive into the world of Django, we'll see a couple of other things that Django has to offer for us that we weren't able to utilize with Flask. Even though Flask is a fantastic tool, there's a lot of things that we would have to create by hand in order to get the same functionality that comes from Django, whereas Django comes with batteries included. It knows that we're going to need specific functionality, so it provides that functionality for us without taking away the ability for the individual developer to create those functionalities themselves if we don't like what Django is providing for us. At this point, this is going to conclude our lecture. Today, we covered a review of SQL schema and relationships, review of how to create a Flask server, connecting Flask to PostgreSQL utilizing a URI, what is a model, creating models, what are views, interacting with models through API views, passing arguments through views. We went over the different types of query sets. What are we missing and why Django? Does anyone have any questions over any of the topics that were covered today? All right, if no one has any questions, I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording.